عرض كتاب الصهيونية أثناء المحرقة للكاتب طوني غرينستين. كاتب يهودي نشأ في عائلة يهودية متدينة. يعبر الكتاب عن سأم الكاتب من استغلال الصهيونية للمحرقة بتبرير الجرائم ضد الفلسطينيين. يشرح الكاتب دعم إسرائيل للنازيين الجدد من العسكر حسب روايته. يوضح الكاتب السجل الحقيقي للصهاينة أثناء المحرقة.
Hello, my name is Tony Greenstein. I was brought up as a Jew in an Orthodox Jewish family, and my father was a rabbi. And I've brought out this book, Zionism During the Holocaust. In fact, the book is about Zionism before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust. Why have I brought it out? Because I am sick and tired of the way the Israeli state and the Zionist movement has exploited and used the Holocaust to justify its crimes against the Palestinian people and the Arab peoples, for that matter. So I want to tell you the true story of the Zionist movement during the Holocaust itself. That is between 1939 and 1945. And this is a story you will not hear very often. Zionism has covered its tracks very well. But today it professes a concern for what happened during the Holocaust. But at the time, the Zionist movement was interested in one thing only, and that was building a Jewish state. Now, before I start, I want to say this. The Holocaust is a fact. It happened. Not only were 6 million Jews killed, but 1 million Gypsies, 500,000 disabled people, 3 million Polish people, 3 million Russian prisoners of war, and millions of Russians and other people. So there is no doubt whatsoever, and millions of Jews and other people were exterminated in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Birkenau, and so on. And if you come across someone who denies the Holocaust, all I have to say to you is they are the political equivalent of those who believe that the earth is flat. Now, I give you an introduction. What was the Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism? Historically, the people who most supported Zionism were themselves anti-Semitic. The best example is Arthur J. Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, who in 1917 signed the Balfour Declaration, which gave to the Zionist movement the land of Palestine, which of course did not belong to the British government in the first place. But in 1905, Balfour, who was then Prime Minister, introduced the Aliens Act, aimed at keeping Jews fleeing the pogroms in Russia from British shores. So Balfour, as he freely confessed, was an anti-Semite. And the Zionists had no problem with that, because if you're a genuine anti-Semite, then you must be a Zionist, because the anti-Semites wanted the Jews to leave their countries and go to Palestine. So a Jewish state was absolutely fine for them. And the second thing is, Jews were not the first Zionists, contrary to all the myths. The first Zionists were Christian Zionists, people like Napoleon, Lord Shaftesbury, Lord Palmerston, and many others besides, because they wanted a Jewish state adjacent to the Suez Canal to protect British interests, which were then the strategic route to India. Now, what happened when the Nazis came to power in 1933? Most Jews were horrified. Absolutely. Here was a fascist government dedicated at that time not to exterminating the Jews, but to expelling them from Germany. There was one group amongst the Jews who didn't react with horror, and that was the Zionist movement, and that was the basis of their collaboration with the Nazis. And the attitude of Zionism to anti-Semitism was that it was very useful. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, said he pardoned and understood anti-Semitism, and he said it had the divine will to good about it. Because without anti-Semitism, there is no Zionism. And the purpose of Zionism is to perpetuate what they call the Jewish nation race in Israel. They do not care particularly for the fate of individual Jews. And this was summed up by Jacob Klatskin, who was the editor of the Zionist newspaper Die Welt from 1909 to 1911, and who founded the Encyclopedia Judaica. And he said, if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead of establishing societies to defend the rights for defence against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defence against our friends who desire to defend our rights. In other words, the Zionists had no problem with anti-Semitism. What they did have a problem with was people who actually defended their rights, because if Jews fought for their rights where they were, then they wouldn't want to go to Palestine, which of course later became Israel. And so when Hitler came to power in January 1933, the Zionists were not unhappy about that, because this would mean an immense boost to the movement for a Jewish state. Berl Katznelson, who was effectively Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion was the first prime minister of Israel. He was a chair of the Jewish Agency, the Zionist government in waiting. Katznelson was a founder of the Israeli Labour Party, Mapai, as well as Ben-Gurion's deputy. He saw the rise of Hitler as, quote, an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or will have. David Ben-Gurion himself was even more optimistic. The Nazis' victory would become, quote, a fertile force for Zionism. And one of the major leaders of German Zionism, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, said that it was morally disturbing to seem to be considered as the favoured children of the Nazi government, particularly when it dissolved anti-Zionist youth groups and seemed in other ways to prefer the Zionists. The Nazis asked for a more Zionist behaviour. So Zionist youth groups and Zionist organisations continued to be legal under the Nazis. Indeed, the Zionist flag could be flown, but anti-Zionist groups, Jewish anti-Zionist groups, were banned. And remember, in Germany in 1933, of the 500,000 Jews in Germany, just 2% were Zionists. 98% were non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. And that was true everywhere in the world but Palestine itself. Zionism was a distinct minority because Zionism was seen as a Jewish form of anti-Semitism. And Emil Ludwig, who was a world-famous biographer and a Zionist, he, in many ways, summed up the Zionist attitude to the rise of Hitler when he said, Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine. You know, the coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. Thousands who seemed to be completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler, and for that I am personally very grateful. That is in a PhD thesis by Etan Bloom of Tel Aviv University. The Zionist national poet is Nachman Bialik, whose name should be well known to people. And he said, and I quote, Hitlerism has perhaps saved German Jewry, which was being assimilated into annihilation. Well, the Jews were annihilated, but it wasn't through anti-Semitism. And what was the Zionist attitude to rescuing the Jews? It was an incredibly cruel. They obstructed all attempts at rescue which were not directed at what was to become the State of Israel. That is Palestine, the Palestine Mandate at the time. And the reason for this was very simple. If you could rescue Jews by sending them to countries other than Palestine, what was the point of having a Jewish state in the first place? So David Ben-Gurion summed up their attitude. This was in 1938, 9th of December 1938. A month before, we had Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, a Nazi-inspired pogrom against the Jews of Germany when virtually every synagogue was burnt down, when plate glass windows were broken, hence the name, and over 100 Jews were killed and 30,000 were interned in concentration camps. And in December, beyond that, the British agreed to admit 10,000 Jewish children to Britain from Germany. What was the reaction of the Zionists? They absolutely opposed it. And Ben-Gurion stated, and this is in his biography, his official biography by Shabtai Teveth, and he said, if I knew it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by bringing them to Eretz Yisrael, that is Palestine, the land of Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the people of Israel. In other words, he was prepared to sacrifice half of the children in order that they could become, in time, settlers in the land of Israel. And this was the attitude of the Zionists. There were a number of different schemes to rescue Jews. Santo Domingo, Alaska, Australia, Darwin, Mindanao in the Philippines, and so on. And the Zionists opposed all of them. The only place where they were happy for Jews to be rescued was Palestine itself, because Zionism has never been about rescuing Jews. And their use of the Holocaust today in order to justify their apartheid state and their war crimes against the Palestinians really defiles the memory of those who died. Because those Jews who died in the gas chambers, and not just the gas chambers, they were shot and so on, they died of hunger, they died as a result of a racist state. And yet Israel is using the memory of those who have died in order to justify their own racism. And this is what the Zionists are. They are really not concerned. And in Israel today, you still have thousands of Holocaust survivors. And the money for them has been stolen by the banks, Bank Leumi. They live in poverty and penury. They either have a choice of eating or heating. And this is despite the fact that Israel spends more than any other country in the world, I think bar Saudi Arabia, on arms and weapons. But Israel will not spend money to support the remaining Holocaust survivors. And Israel established, in order, if you like, to weaponize and to turn into its own narrative of the Holocaust, Yad Vashem. This is the Holocaust Propaganda Museum in Israel, and it was established in 1953. And it has distorted and twisted the memory of the Holocaust in order to serve the Zionist narrative. For example, as far as it is concerned, the only people who died were Jewish. It doesn't recognize any other victim. But it's really even worse than that, because it really is a propaganda museum. Every diplomat who comes to Israel is taken to Yad Vashem, which is in Jerusalem. And this includes people like John Vorster, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, who was imprisoned during the war because he was a Nazi, because he supported the Nazis. It includes Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who is an open anti-Semite. It includes Bolsonaro and Philip Duterte of the Philippines, presidents of both countries, who were open Hitler lovers and worshippers. Every fascist and every racist who comes to Israel pays homage at Yad Vashem. And Yad Vashem, you know, it is situated barely a quarter of a mile from Deir Yassin, the village which in April 1948, the Zionists massacred over 100 Palestinians, mainly women, children and old people. And one of the guides Itamar Shapiro. He pointed out in 2009 to the people he was guiding around Yad Vashem that Deir Yassin was very nearby. He was sacked on the spot, because they don't want any mention of the Palestinians. And not once has Yad Vashem ever protested against any act of racism against the Palestinians or anyone else, because Zionism opposes the universalization of the lessons of the Holocaust. Because if the Holocaust teaches us anything, it is about the evils of racism. It is about where racism can lead, which includes genocide. Yad Vashem does not want to know. As far as it is concerned, the only people who died were Jewish. And it's really even worse than that. Every year, Israel takes thousands of school children to Auschwitz, which is near Krakow in Poland, where something like 1.5 million Jews were exterminated in the gas chambers. What does it do this for? Is it to teach them about the evils of racism? No, it's to instill in them nationalism, chauvinism, and militarization. It is to justify everything that Israel does. And Gideon Levy, who is a famous correspondent in Haaretz, the only liberal Israeli daily, wrote this, and I quote, "I have yet to hear a single teenager come back from Auschwitz and say that we mustn't abuse others the way that we were abused. There has yet to be a school whose pupils came back from Birkenau, which is where most of the gas chambers were, straight to the Gaza border, saw the barbed wire fence and said, 'Never again.' The message is always the opposite. Gaza is permitted because of Auschwitz." And this is the outrage that the Zionists have committed, that they actually justify what they're doing because the Jews themselves were persecuted. And you know, Yehuda Alkana, you will not have heard of him, but he was the professor and the rector of the Central European University, which was based in Budapest before Viktor Orban, the anti-Semitic Prime Minister of Hungary, and Benjamin Netanyahu's good friend, threw him out, and threw the whole university out for that matter. And he wrote an article in Haaretz in 1988, "The Need to Forget," and he warned that the very existence of democracy is endangered when the memory of the dead participate actively in the democratic process. And he warned against the misuse of the lessons of the Holocaust. He said, "A profound existential angst fed by a particular interpretation of the lessons of the Holocaust that we are the eternal victim. In this ancient belief, I see the tragic and paradoxical victory of Hitler. Two nations, metaphorically speaking, emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz, a minority who assert this must never happen again, and a frightened, haunted majority who assert this must never happen to us again." And that is the difference between the Zionist lessons of Auschwitz, and not just Auschwitz, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and the other extermination camps like Majdanek, and the anti-fascist and anti-racist response. The Zionists say this must never happen again to Jews, whereas we say this must never happen again to anyone, whether it's in Rwanda, whether it's Cambodia, whether it's any country. Genocide is an evil, whoever it happens to, whether it's the Armenians for that matter. Genocide is something that should have been banished many, many years ago. But for the Zionists, genocide is only wrong if it happens to Jews. And so we have an incremental genocide of the Palestinians, the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Day by day, children are killed by Israel in its vicious and brutal occupation. But the Zionists have a number of themes, if you like. They say, first of all, that the Holocaust is unique to the Jews. But, you know, I mean, every genocide is unique, but the Holocaust was no more unique than, say, the slave trade or any other genocide. They say that the Holocaust is inexplicable. It's nothing to do with fascism or racism or Nazism. It was simply because the Jews existed and they were Jews. And then they say that the Arabs were the ones who caused it. It's very interesting the way the Zionists used the Holocaust against the Palestinians. And I want to quote a Holocaust, a political philosopher, a political historian from Tel Aviv, it's Jerusalem, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Edith Zertel, Professor Edith Zertel. And she wrote, in the Israeli Holocaust and the Politics of Nationhood, the transference of the Holocaust situation onto the Middle East reality not only created a false sense of the imminent danger of mass destruction, it also immensely distorted the image of the Holocaust, dwarfed the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, trivialized the unique agony of the victims and the survivors, and utterly demonized the Arabs and their leaders. And she went on to say that there hasn't been a war that Israel has been involved in, that has not been perceived, quote, has not been perceived, defined and conceptualized in terms of the Holocaust. Israel has mobilized the Holocaust in the service of Israeli politics. And that is the reality. For Israel, the Holocaust has been instrumentalized against the Palestinians. And no one is more guilty of that than Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister. You may remember in 2015, at the World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem, Benjamin Netanyahu referred to the Palestinian leader, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj al-Min Husseini, a big picture of which still exists in Yad Vashem. Because for the Zionists, Hajj al-Min Husseini personified Palestinian anti-Semitism. Now let's be clear, he was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He had never been elected by the Palestinians or the Arabs. He was imposed by Herbert Samuel, the Zionist British High Commissioner. There was elections. He came fourth in the elections. He shouldn't have been put in a position. But because he was a reactionary nationalist, he was imposed by the British and by the Zionists. And the Mufti, during the war, did collaborate with the Nazis. He met Hitler in a famous meeting in November 1941. And what Netanyahu told his audience was that Hitler only wanted to expel the Jews. It was the Mufti who gave him the idea of destroying or exterminating them. And this was a lie. It was a total lie. On the 4th of December, barely a week after their meeting, the first extermination camp at Chelmno opened its doors. Belzec opened shortly after. And then Auschwitz had already existed and had already gassed prisoners, Polish and Russian prisoners as it happens, also began operations shortly after. But for Ben-Gurion and for Netanyahu and for other Zionist leaders, they want to turn the Palestinians into the new Nazis. And you know, not just the Zionists either. Every enemy of the West has been called the new Hitler. Saddam Hussein was the new Hitler. Gamal Abdel Nasser was the new Hitler. When the Israelis were invading Lebanon and they surrounded Beirut, Menachem Begin referred to Yasser Arafat as Hitler in his bunker. The Zionists have always used the Nazis in order to justify their atrocious and terrible war crimes. And you know, the Zionists weren't content with that. They also wanted to say that the Holocaust was unique in the sense that only Jews suffered and that there was no explanation for what happened. And that when it came to the Gypsies, for example, They denied that they'd been exterminated. They denied there'd been a Gypsy Holocaust. And there was a famous debate between Yehudi, the main Zionist Holocaust historian, and Sybil Milton, the resident historian, the chief resident historian at the US Holocaust Museum. And Bohr openly said the Nazis persecuted the Gypsies not because of who they were, not because they were non-Aryans, but because they were asocial, because they were criminals, because they were wanderers and didn't settle down. And Sybil Milton, and this is a famous exchange in the history teacher, which you can look up, she said, defining an entire ethnic group as antisocial and criminal is a classic example of racism. I do not know why Mr. Bohr does not understand this. And that can be found in correspondence and also in an article, Gypsies and the Holocaust, if you look it up. I want to ask you, if you want and you want to know more, to read this book, Zionism During the Holocaust. It will tell you many things that you've never heard of, including Israel's support of the neo-Nazi Argentinian junta after the war. If you want to buy it, you can contact me at Tony Greenstein 104 at gmail.com, and I will give you details. But I want you to understand what was the real record of the Zionists during the Holocaust, because they did not want to know. They did not publicize the Holocaust. They did not warn anyone about the Holocaust. And they even said the Holocaust wasn't happening. They denied there was a Holocaust at times. They were in many ways Holocaust deniers when the Holocaust was happening. They only learnt and they only went on about the Holocaust many, many years later. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you read my book. It's the first book for over 40 years which provides a comprehensive account of what the Zionists actually did during the Holocaust. Thank you.